Welcome to Auntie Lou's Hour. If you like this podcast,
I am
please
so
like, comment,
happy
share,
that you
and
are
subscribe.
finally here, Eugene Lynch. Now, I have to say, Eugene, that I've been looking at your TikToks and watching some of your story, and I must say, I mean, you know this saying, I'm sure you do. Vulnerability is strength. So you're a very strong man, very courageous man. And actually, the icing on the cake is that I do not detect an ego for a very intelligent guy, you know? So with that said, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And yeah, good, good. And I'm just bursting to ask you some questions. Could we just cover off the old HIV malarkey before we start? Then we get into the interesting stuff like travel and food. Um, you're originally from Ireland, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
I'm a little bit more curious. I mean, yeah, for viewers that don't know, for people who are listening for the first time, um, Eugene's living with HIV. But I'm really, and he got really kind of what's the word? Oh, it's the word interesting story, authentic story, inspiring story, challenging story. So many words come up. But before we get there, I'm really curious about little Eugene from Ireland.
It's funny you say little Eugene because I was always well, my mom always called me young Eugene because my dad's name is also Eugene. So I'm a junior. I'm Eugene
Yeah.
Junior. So I've always been kind of like little Eugene, although I'm much taller than my dad now, so they stopped calling me that. So
Hey, have they ever called you Junior? Do your family call you Junior?
no, no. Although when I first started signing up for things like bank accounts or whatever, anything that would send me mail, I would sign up with Junior at the end of it, so that when it
Okay,
came in the post, we'd know whether it was for me or my dad. Um,
know that.
but
You,
nobody
are you
nobody
the
calls me
eldest?
Junior.
You're the eldest, youngest?
I am the middle child, which probably explains a lot about me and my
Oh, it
background.
does, it does. So what was it like growing up in Ireland?
Well, I had quite a, I mean, normal upbringing. Grew up in a very poor working class area, like inner city Dublin. The house that we lived in, so it was my mum, dad, and two sisters, and me. It was a two-bedroom house, so I shared a bedroom with my two sisters until I was like 11 years old. And we were, when they say like the wrong side of the tracks,
Yeah.
we were on the tracks. So right in front of our house, there was a railway line that took goods to and from the port. And then just above that, there was the main line from Dublin to Belfast that crossed. So, and our house was at the intersection of those two. So we grew up in a house where there was always lots of noise, and because there was like goods trains going up and down, like right in front of our house, the whole house would shake. And you'd have trains going past at 3, 4 in the morning, and the house would shake. We didn't notice any different because I grew up in that house, so like I just got used
Yeah.
to it. And we moved house when I was like 11 years old. I got my own bedroom, like a tiny little box room. My two
Wow,
sisters
yeah.
shared the other room in this new house. But it was really quiet, and our entire family, when we moved to this house, couldn't sleep for days because it was too quiet. But yeah, I had a fairly normal upbringing, as I say. My mum looked after, so my older sister was the eldest, then me, then my younger sister, and then my mum's two sisters then eventually had kids of their own. So I had four younger cousins, all male. And
Yeah.
my mum's sisters went back to work after they had their kids, so they came to us like my mum looked after all of my cousins in the house
Yeah.
after school and stuff like that. So it was always like a really busy. And then actually after the four boys, my mum took on it was initially two and then three and then four girls from another family that she was kind of child minding. So for me, there was
Oh.
always like other kids coming along down the line in
Mm.
the household. So I learned how to change a nappy by the time I was like 12 or 14 or something.
Ah.
And look after younger kids.
So did you come out as queer or gay when you was in Dublin, or was that when you came to London?
Yeah,
Did
I was quite lucky in many ways. So I went to Catholic school. I went to all boys Catholic school. And I was a nerd. So like I was very studious and like good at
yeah.
school. I started school very young. I was one of the youngest in my class, and my mum, because she wanted kind of bigger and better things for us, sent us to a school that was in a different area, in a better area, to be
Yeah,
honest, like a
yeah,
better
yeah.
school. So we traveled like quite far to go to school every day. Um, and when I first started school, I was the kid that nobody knew with the quite common accent, in this slightly, I mean, it wasn't a posh
Uh,
school by any stretch of the imagination, but it was
yeah,
just in a
yeah,
nicer area. So I really felt like other at that point.
yeah,
And
yeah.
eventually I, got some friends in primary school. So I had one friend in particular who I would have met when I was 4 or 5 years old, and we stayed friends, you know, throughout our entire school career. And then by the time I got to secondary school, I had a group of, there were five of us. We were all nerds, and four out of the five of us were queer. So,
Oh,
and that
right.
was, I don't know whether that was instinct or coincidence or whatever, but we all kind of came out to each other in between primary and secondary school. So I was like
Oh,
out to my friends when I was like 12, 13.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
came out to my parents. I was probably 16, I would have said. I was one of the last in my kind of group of friends to come out to my parents. Um, and people in my secondary school, like quite a few people, would have known that I and my friends were like queer. So,
Yeah,
and that
yeah.
was very unusual for kind of 1990s Catholic school
Yeah,
in Dublin. But I think partly because we were the nerds and we were kind of top of the class, people left us alone largely.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
They just
yeah.
thought it was a bit weird that they
Quick,
didn't want to get involved.
because because like you are, you're intelligent. I can see that from the various times that I've met you, and that's why I say I see that intelligence, but I don't see that egotistical kind of that can sometimes go with that. So I'm not surprised, and I'm glad that you confirmed that at school you wasn't academically challenged.
No, I was quite lucky. And in many ways,
Yeah,
like um, I I always knew that I kind of thought differently to others because I remember the first time I ever did an exam, it was towards the end of primary school, and I came in the morning of the exam, and one of the guys who sat near me was like really worked up about the fact that we were doing an exam, and he's like, "Oh, I was
yeah.
studying last night," and I had absolutely no concept of what studying was. Nobody had ever talked to me about it. I didn't know what it was. I was like, "What do you mean studying?" He's like, I was looking over the questions and answers last night," and I'm like, "Surely that's just cheating. Either you know this stuff or you don't." Like, I did not understand
Oh,
at
right.
all what this
Interesting.
was, and I suppose I found it easy to learn and to
Yeah,
retain information. So
yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't
yeah,
find exams difficult, and I
yeah,
didn't have to do that much work. It felt
yeah,
like
yeah,
maybe a little
yeah,
bit
yeah,
lazy, maybe I don't know.
yeah. Oh, that's great. So what I'll tell you what I'm really curious about, Eugene, because a little birdie told me, or I overheard you saying that you worked in the financial sector, so you had quite a one of those jobs, didn't you? What's that like? Like, what sort of work was you doing?
Yeah. So my first job was I worked in a department store called Penny's in Ireland, which is Primark.
Yeah,
Yeah. I started there when I was 15, which technically was underage. I'm not sure they actually quite realized what age I was, but I worked there for like 5 years during university and everything. And I loved that job actually. I was just like a, shop floor sales
yeah,
assistant.
yeah,
But then after university, I was kind of looking around for what kind of job to do. And I did a business degree. So I did international
yeah,
commerce and French. And the type of uh, the kind of course that was in Ireland, it was really hard to get into. There were only a few
yeah,
places, and it kind of was supposed to be setting you up for a career in a particular area. And I was looking at the
yeah,
different careers on offer. I
yeah,
didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't really have any role. I was the first person in my entire family to go to university, so I
yeah,
was kind of
yeah.
like setting the scene for everybody who came after me. But I didn't know like I didn't have a concept of a graduate job because nobody in my family ever had one. So
Mm,
I didn't know what I
mm,
wanted to do. I knew I wanted to work somewhere in something like in business or in finance or whatever. And then I applied for a few different jobs in banks and things, but the one that I ended up applying for, and I got on really well in the interview, and I really liked it, was management consulting. So I applied to one of the big four accounting firms that had a consulting arm, and the reason I liked that was it used a lot of the skills that I built up in my business degree in lots of different ways, but it also had a lot of variety. So you could do lots of different things when you were a management consultant. You weren't like stuck to one type of job. And because I was quite indecisive about what I wanted to do, I thought this is perfect. It sounds like a
Yeah.
prestigious job. It's relatively well paid.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
applied in London, so I did my
yeah,
interviews in London, and I was, I knew I was going to move at that point because I kind of felt after having lived in France for a year, and that was my first experience of living away from home because I stayed at
yeah,
home during university. I was like, yeah, I definitely want to move somewhere else to like a big city and start a career. And
yeah.
I did loads of different um, types of role within consulting, mostly within either financial services or the public sector, but they were all sort of jobs that were related to transformation. So finance transformation, like changing the way an organization did
Yeah.
its, support services essentially was the type of job that I did. And eventually I ended up being responsible for the training of all the junior people to do that type of work like across Europe.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah,
there was a lot of travel involved, which I actually really liked. So, my typical week would be get up at 4 a.m. on Monday morning, go to Heathrow, fly somewhere, stay there till Thursday, come home, work from the office, like our office in London or from home on the Friday. It felt like very kind of jet set and glamorous. And like I was like obsessed with air miles at the time. So I was like doing anything I could to build up my air miles. But it was quite intense and it takes a lot out of you. And I relatively quickly developed imposter syndrome, what I now know is imposter syndrome. So I kind of felt like everybody else knew what they were doing and I didn't. And I knew that wasn't true because like I'd had, some of the best training you could get to have a job like this, but everybody else seemed to be a lot more confident than me. I had a lot of doubt, and when you're working in a job like consulting, part of the job is you have to be able to convince people with confidence that such and such is the right course of action. And I was the kind of person who's like, I don't know if this is the right course of action. I've done all the sums to tell me whether or not it is, but it might not be. I could be wrong. And like that level of doubt is something that other people didn't seem to have, or if they did, they were able to hide it better than me. And I always felt like I wasn't quite as good, as a result. But that job taught me a lot of things. It gave me a lot of experience in a lot of different areas, and I did it for 15 years. So I really stuck with it.
So was that the job that you was in when you found out you had HIV?
Yeah, yeah, it was. So I started that job in 2004, and in 2013 I got my diagnosis, and then I continued to work there till like 2019. And the day I remember, I woke up one Monday morning not feeling well, and knowing that it wasn't just cold or flu, so I had to go see the doctor.
Mm.
And I made an appointment, went to see the doctor. She said I had shingles and that she needed to do extra tests, and they took blood. And a couple of days later, I got the phone call to come in to the GP's office, and I was already back to work at that point. So I was like, I remember I was sitting in my company's office in London when the phone call came through from the GP to say we need you to come in at the end of the day. And I was like really busy. I was like, I don't, can you not just tell me over the phone? Like, do I
Yeah,
have to come?
yeah.
But it sounded important.
Got planes to catch. I've got, air miles to, tell me over the phone.
So yeah, I went in and that was where I got the diagnosis. And the next morning I was in the HIV clinic getting all the extra tests, um, and I sort of knew straight away that I wasn't going to tell anyone in work. That was like immediately I was like, okay, they know that I haven't been well for the last few days. They know I've had to go for tests or whatever. I'd already previously kind of told my line manager, I guess, that I was struggling with mental health because I had,
Yeah.
I'd previously been diagnosed with depression and stuff.
Mm.
Um, but when I got my HIV diagnosis, all of that got a lot worse very quickly. But I felt
Yeah.
so ashamed at the fact that I'd got HIV that I was like, I'm never going to tell anyone in work. Like I might tell them that I need to go for an appointment, but I wouldn't be specific about what. But I was determined that nobody was going to find out about my HIV. Um, and part of it, I realized later after a lot of therapy and stuff was a lot of like internalized homophobia and stuff like that.
Yeah.
People at work knew, like I was out at work, and I had a partner, and people knew that I had a partner, but I wanted to come across, particularly because I had imposter syndrome at the same time, I wanted to come across as like I'm in a really stable relationship, everything's good. I happen to be queer, but I'm really, really normal. Like that was what I was trying to come across as. And I kind of thought if they find out about the HIV, they're going to make loads of assumptions about the type of person I am and like what I might get up to and what my relationship must be like and all this kind of stuff. So I was like, no, I'm not going to go there. And that made everything worse because it was really isolating. Like I didn't feel like I could talk to anyone about it really. Um, and
But do you know what? Sorry, Julie, but do you know what? That's why it's so important. And I really kind of think it's important for people to hear, especially if they're starting their working career or if they're in work and if they're in types of jobs that, office work in particular, and you're of a particular position and you've got imposter syndrome. Because I would say so many people have imposter syndrome. You're looking at the person next to you, you've got targets, etc. And then you get HIV, you
yeah,
know?
and it was one of those places where they try to have a high performance culture. So like there's a lot of targets that you need to try and
Yeah,
hit, and like um,
yeah,
everybody was supposed to be quite high performing. And I kind of thought, and because it was project based and you'd get assigned to projects, and partly
yeah,
based on, whether the like directors or the managers of the project or whatever knew that you were good at your job and stuff like that. And I kind of thought, if people think I have HIV, maybe they'll think that I'm going to get ill more often or like I'm not going to
yeah,
be able to do my job.
yeah,
And so like
yeah,
maybe I can't be high performing if, people will think I can't be high performing if I have HIV. So I'm not going to tell them.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Oh, I so relate to you, Eugene, when you talk about work, like there must be people listening to this that are having a hard time at work. People always have a hard time at work for whatever reason. And basically you never know what goes on behind closed doors, do you? You never know what goes on behind closed doors when you're at work and what people are going through. So um you found you got a diagnosis that you're living with HIV. You kept it quiet. You didn't want to share it with anyone. What I found quite interesting is where I could relate to you when I was watching your one of your vlogs on TikTok, where you said you didn't want to talk about it, you didn't want to go to any classes, you just didn't want it to exist. Can you explain what that was like and where your head at? Because I felt the same, but I want to hear it from your point of view.
yeah. I think partly this is probably where ego does come in, to some
Yeah,
extent,
yeah,
because
yeah.
I got the diagnosis. I was at the HIV clinic, and um, I remember like talking about this kind of thought process when I got some therapy later on, and
Hmm.
I realized that not only did I have a lot of internalized homophobia, I had a lot of very negative thoughts about HIV that I was
Yeah,
suddenly applying to myself that I didn't know were there. Like they were under the surface.
yeah,
So I was like, like going to the HIV clinic, being like, what kind of person is here? And like
yeah,
literally being the person that was there, but going like, because you hear all these things about people with HIV and like
yeah,
how
yeah.
terrible they must be. And,
Oh yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah.
so a lot of that was happening under the surface that I didn't realize. But then when I was speaking to the consultant and they were, obviously they knew I was in shock and stuff when I got the diagnosis. And they said, there's counseling, mental health support that we can refer you to, or peer support. You can go and speak to other people living with HIV. And I was just immediately like, no, 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 don't want to do any of that. That
Yeah,
sounds horrible. I don't want to sit in a room full of people and talk about my problems. Like,
yeah,
just
yeah,
no. Um, and that that was one of the like you could talk about like things that you might regret or various like mistakes that you think you've made in your life. But I think if I'd
yeah,
made a different choice at that point, things probably would have been a lot better, a lot quicker than they were. So like if there's anyone listening to this thinking like I was recently diagnosed, or even I've been diagnosed a long time, but I've never really talked to anyone about it, and I don't feel like I'm going to benefit from counseling or peer support or something like that. I would say give it a try because it like eventually getting that support has completely changed my life and my view of myself and my view of the world, and it's just made life a lot easier to live, just being able to talk about what's really going on for me. And I think if I did that at the time, things might have gone differently for me.
So you said internalized homophobia. Explain a little bit more. What was going on there?
Um, I I think about it a lot in terms of like a work context. So I was going to work every day, and not that many people that I was working with were like visibly or openly queer in any kind of
Yeah,
way. Like we set up while I was there like a network, and we started being a bit more visible and stuff. But um, because you were trying to fit in and perform and not seem less than anyone else, but I felt like I was less than everyone else because I it was a very, at the time, quite a masculine culture. The
mm,
majority of the partners in that partnership were men, um, and there was a lot of like things like chats that would happen in the pub, or people would go and do various kind of like sports and stuff, and that was just not that wasn't me at all. And I didn't get involved in any of that, but I felt like that was going
yeah,
to hold me back because like
yeah.
I wasn't able to engage in that way with other people. And actually, at the time, all of my favorite managers and partners that I worked for were all women. Like the small
Mm,
number that were there, I loved working for. So I don't
yeah,
know, like I don't know what that might tell you. Um, but the internalized homophobia was like this thought that when I went to work, I needed to suppress who I was so that I wouldn't upset anyone, so that I
yeah,
would seem like I
yeah,
was like everyone else and that I was good enough to be there.
yeah.
Um, and anything that would come up that might set me apart, I would try and suppress or hide. And like it went as far as like I would go to work in a pair of boring black trousers and a white shirt every day and try to blend into the background. And in a
Yeah,
culture where you're supposed to be like standing out and performing and be like being quite out
yeah,
there and visible and shouting about yourself. Someone who, like, I'm an introvert, I'm trying to suppress my queerness and I'm trying not to be seen. Like, that was never going to
yeah.
go well for me, even from a work perspective. You know what I mean? Um, but that's what I was doing. I was like, if I maybe people won't notice me and I can get I can get past everything under the radar if I don't shout too much about it like I did. And at the time I was like, oh, I'm like out and proud because I talk about the fact that I've got a boyfriend and we're in a long-term relationship and like
Yeah.
so I felt like I was being honest, but what I didn't realize was everything I was suppressing.
That's just so interesting. And I was gonna ask you, hold on, is it gone? Um, oh, it's gone. I was gonna ask you something about, oh, it's gone, sorry. So work, you were trying to do your best, internalized homophobia. Oh yeah, I know what I want to ask you. So you spoke about anxiety. I'm not sure if it was anxiety and depression or just anxiety. Was it both?
It was
Was it
both,
both?
but the
It was
anxiety
both.
ended up being the bigger problem pretty quickly.
So has it, is it still there? Is it manageable? Is it just the way that it was? Is it different? What is that journey like from where you were then, pre HIV diagnosis to where you are now? What was that journey like for your anxiety and depression?
um I think the issues that were going on under the surface, like the imposter syndrome, the internalized homophobia, all that kind of stuff, was part of the reason why I was kind of depressed even before my HIV diagnosis.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and it was fairly low level, but it
Mm,
was having a bit of an impact. And I I used to completely let loose at the weekends. So I would, do my, I was going to say 9 to 5. It was a lot longer hours than that, but I would do my usual kind of Monday to Friday work, and then I would just like go out and get wasted at the weekend,
Yeah.
basically, and just,
Yeah.
be free and, do whatever. And that was my outlet. But then it started to become like my crutch. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it started to kind of consume more and more of my week. And I would drink a lot, and then I started getting into drugs a bit, like club drugs initially. But when I first kind of started taking drugs and it took away my anxiety, I thought, oh, this is the way I want to feel all the time. So
Ah.
that um, that started me down a path, basically, of thinking like I have all these problems, but there's this one solution in a magic pill or in a powder or in whatever. That means that I can stop feeling that way. And once that connection had been made in my brain, it was like the thing I wanted to do all the time
Of
eventually.
course.
Like it
Yeah.
wasn't straight away, it took a while, but it went
Yeah.
from being like Friday night to Friday and Saturday night to all weekend to seeping into the
Yeah.
week. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and that and that made like the come downs and the mood swings that that would entail made everything worse
Mm.
ultimately. My anxiety started getting more and more about I didn't want people to find out who the real me was because
Yeah.
I was afraid of kind of who that is. And it was all kind of self-reinforcing. So,
Yeah.
the more I tried to avoid the feelings, the worse it became. And the and I felt like if I was really honest about how I felt and what was happening, that people would see me as being less than. And I started to kind of put all these things together. So I kind of thought, well, if I tell people like how anxious I am all the time, they'll start asking me questions, and then they might like pick away at the surface and eventually find out that I'm living with HIV and that I take drugs at the weekends, and I didn't want that to happen. Um, and that led me into a corner basically because I didn't feel like I could get help without everything falling apart. Um,
Yeah.
and what I needed was for everything fall apart to fall apart so that I could start
Yeah.
to put it together again.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I wasn't really holding it together in the first place. My performance started suffering at work. My relationship. So when I was diagnosed, I had been with my partner for 6 years. He's HIV negative, um, and I started trying to hide things from him as well. So he knew about my HIV. We got him tested. He
Mm.
was very supportive. But the more I started to kind of use drugs, and the more I started to go down this like line of thinking, the more I tried to hide it from him, and the harder that became as well, because like I wasn't being honest in my relationship, and um, I wasn't being honest
That's,
at work, and it felt really isolating.
I mean, that's something to remember. I think, when you start hiding stuff from people, you have to ask yourself, like, what's going on there? It is. I mean, I used to hide lots of my shopping. Why am I hiding my shopping? Either it's okay or it's not. But I know it's something, true, but it's something to kind of think about. I'm really curious about Eugene. So you spoke about um like when your partner asked you how you got HIV, you said, oh, it was probably where I was taking drugs. I was like snorting something, coke or whatever it was, and you could have caught it that way. And and then you go on in your TikTok to say you cannot get HIV through, sharing, what do you call it,
Like
straws or
yeah, straw or rolled up
yeah.
banknote or something like that.
But the thing that got me is where you said you can't, but you could get something like Hep C.
Yeah, there is a very small. It would be very unusual, and it's a very
Unusual.
very small risk. But if you had blood that you got like from your nose onto that, and somebody else used it, and they had a route of entry into their bloodstream, so if they cut themselves or
Ah,
something, you're not going to get HIV that way. But there's a
mm,
small possibility you might get something like Hep C or Hep B.
yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of understand that because I actually started Googling it, like, I didn't know that. Not that I need to know because I don't do drugs anymore. Stay in school, kids.
Recently, I've been doing quite a bit of work in prisons, and
Yeah,
we talk about like HIV in prisons, and there's like the Hep C Trust do a lot of work in prisons as well. So they're often telling people not to share razor blades or toothbrushes or hair clippers, just because of the small possibility of passing on hepatitis through those things. And when we go in and talk to people, they're like, they list all of these things that they think are going to give them HIV. We're like, okay, so don't unlearn that for Hep C,
yeah,
but it doesn't apply
yeah.
to HIV. Um,
Be surprised about this. The Hep C stuff. About razor blades. When you said there's a small risk, but there's still a risk, and people need to know that, and then they can make decisions.
yeah, but people don't get HIV that way. Um,
Yeah.
because it's a much more fragile virus. It doesn't survive outside the human body in the way that hepatitis can.
So you used to use drugs and alcohol as a way to anchor you, as a way to hold you in a space that was fun and confident and exciting, and now that crutch is no longer there. Have you replaced it with anything else?
Not really. I'm not in the same way. So, part of the reason that I was using all of those things was that I was suppressing my feelings and past traumas and stuff like that. So when I finally did get some help around all of that, what really helped me was looking at those feelings and what was underlying them, what was causing them, past traumas, secrets that I was holding on to. Um, Once I talked about that stuff and got a lot of help and support in therapy, um, it all became a lot easier to deal with. And now I have coping mechanisms that actually serve me well. So, if I'm struggling, I will have people that I can talk to tell that I'm struggling. And I don't feel like I'm, weak or useless or less than in a way that I
Well
used
done.
to because I tell someone like I'm feeling down today or
Yeah,
I'm anxious about something in particular. And there's a whole set of tools that I have now that I've learned through getting help, but also like recovery from drugs and alcohol. Like I work a program of recovery from drugs and alcohol
yeah,
that involves me talking to other people who are in recovery. And um, one of the simple things was like checking out my reality. Like I was taught that in
yeah,
rehab and by therapists and stuff. And I could get myself really worked up about the way that I thought other people felt about me or about a
yeah,
situation or whatever. And it's so simple, but like therapists kind of taught me that, well, ask them how they feel. Like, don't go around
yeah,
asking people how they feel all the time because that, but I would say to my partner, like, oh, I'm worried about this because I'm worried you might think this. And he'd be like,
yeah,
oh, I don't think that. I'm worried about something that happened in work. So
yeah,
like
yeah,
just that, and I don't have to do that anymore
yeah,
because my like the way that I think has kind of reset. But in the early days, I used to use things like that to help just kind of center me and right size problems and not like catastrophize everything. Because like I could make the smallest problem massive just by thinking myself into a corner. And that's not helpful. Like it doesn't serve me well. So I've got things that do serve me well now, like reaching out and speaking to people
yeah.
and I for a long time I would do things like uh meditate and
Mhm.
go for walks and be mindful and put down my phone and be present and stuff like that. And I, it's not that I don't do that anymore, but I don't need it as much as I did before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've kind of like
And
reset.
and the thing is, Eugene, you're going to probably agree with this. We go through flows in life, don't we? We go through flows where we're meditating every 2 seconds, for an hour at a time, and then we go through flows in life where you just don't want to do it at all, and that's okay. Instead, maybe you go on holiday. So,
Yeah, when I put down drugs and alcohol, I started relying a bit too much on caffeine. I did some
yeah,
compulsive shopping for a while.
yeah,
overeating has always been a problem in my life, and I started doing that quite a bit. And but I had the tools, people around me,
Yeah.
and ways to be able to see that that was happening and to
Yeah.
make some changes before it got bad. It's like so bad. And during lockdown, I had been cycling a lot to go to like recovery meetings and get where I needed to go. And I took up swimming for the first time in a while. I used to swim a lot when I was a kid. Um, and I wanted to be a bit more active. And then lockdown hit, and
Yeah.
I knew I wanted to stay active in some way. So having always hated running throughout my life, I
Me too.
decided to give it a go again. And slowly but surely, I managed to build up like the amount I could run, and I started to really enjoy it. And so like running became a thing that I did, and that kind of helped me. Um, and it's funny because the amount of anxiety I had, like I was one of the reasons I wouldn't go out and run on the street was I would be afraid of people looking at me thinking like, oh, this person's terrible at running, or like I don't know, like lots of thoughts
Yeah.
about like.
Yeah.
But during lockdown, there was nobody on the street, so I had loads of time to like
Yeah.
practice while nobody was watching. So that was
So
kind of nice.
did you say that you used to run as a kid, or did you take running up as an adult? Was it something you?
When I was a kid, the only sport I was ever good at or interested in was swimming, and I used to do that a lot. But then in secondary school, I joined my school's running team. They had a cross-country running team. I was terrible at running. I didn't enjoy running, but a couple of my friends were joining the running team, and I wanted to get more active, partly because
Yeah.
I had issues around my self-image and weight and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and I would come dead last every time. Like I was terrible at running, and eventually I developed a problem in my foot, plantar fasciitis, and that
I've
was a
heard of that.
really good reason to stop. So I was about like 14 or 15. Oh, sorry. I was
Yeah.
about 14 or 15 when I gave up that running, and I didn't do it for very long, and I wasn't good at it, and I didn't train much. But then like in my late 30s, I you know gave it a go and really started to enjoy it. And then I
Yeah.
worked up to do a 10K. I have signed up to do the marathon next year, the
I
London Marathon,
know.
and
Mm.
I got an injury. I injured my knee a
Oh.
couple of months ago, and that kind of put me out of action for a while. So I'm really not at the stage I would need to be yet. But I'm going to give it a go. Even if I have to walk most of it, I'm sure I
Can
probably
I
be able to
say,
do it.
I would send you, I'm going to send you some information maybe after this podcast, but there's a woman that I know and she fixed my knees, literally fixed them because I found it really difficult to go up and down steps. I think it was all that twerking when I was younger. But anyway, the knees have gone and he's a Rolfer. It's called Rolfing, Rolfing. Rolfing. Not many people know about it. And I went to her, and she basically they realign your body from your head to your toe gets realigned. So she done all this manipulation of my fascia, and for even my jaws, she kind of put back into place. And my knees are fine. So maybe I'll give you her number, and maybe if that's something that you want to think about, to get your knees back in order for the marathon. Because I've just sponsored you. Of you
Thank you. That's really kind of you.
about how do you feel about running the marathon?
Sorry?
How do you feel about that? Like, is it the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I've done 10Ks and stuff before. Never did anything. I mean, I think I did a half marathon when I was a teenager, but like that took me forever. Um, I wanted a challenge, and I also wanted something to kind of work up to as well.
Yeah, yeah,
I did that with the previous 10Ks that I did. I was kind of trying to work up to doing them, and it helped me to lose weight. And that was one of the
yeah,
reasons that I'm, trying to do this
yeah.
is to kind of get more towards my target weight.
I mean,
And
don't you find, Eugene? So for me, like drugs and alcohol, do you have any alcohol now, or you just stay away from it altogether? Do you have
no,
any alcohol?
I'm not
Yeah,
able to do anything without
yeah,
going way overboard. So yeah, no, it's
yeah.
been
Me
six
too.
years now, no alcohol.
Yeah, people that can just have a little glass of wine. I can't, it's a couple of bottles. And I got married, was it last year? And we didn't have any alcohol. We didn't drink alcohol. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't really want to go back there. But what I was going to say is, when I was taking like a lot of alcohol and drugs, I found that it was quick, it was easy, it was social, it was fun. I will not talk about the bits where I was munged over the next day, I was tired, I was coming down. No, let's just talk about all the fun parts of it. So when you stop doing that, it does force you to look at what you're going to do with yourself. How you're going to spend your time. And it looks like you found like running to do that.
Yeah. I also took up volunteering. I did a few different volunteer roles, like in the HIV sector, to kind of give back for the support that I got. But my partner and I started volunteering with guide dogs, so we foster guide dogs for the blind at home, and like that's given me like a real sense of purpose
Yeah.
and achievement. And like I was never able to take care of myself, but now I'm like taking care of something else. So that's kind of nice. Um, but what I would say is like when I first started getting into drugs and alcohol, like in a serious way, it was mainly about taking away my social anxiety so I could be in social spaces and not be so anxious about it and just kind of be a bit freer and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. But relatively quickly, it started to be something that I almost had to do and that I sought out. And it wasn't like, it
Yeah.
wasn't a means to an end, it was the end itself, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But I also, I went one step further than that. So I went to the point where I was completely isolated in order to do more drugs
Oh,
and alcohol. So, like, I would sometimes go out with friends and like drink and take drugs and whatever, but then like go home and continue on my own. And then eventually I stopped going out and I was trying to get everyone else out of my life, out of my
yeah. So you
way
could,
so I could just do
yeah.
the drugs and alcohol. So like my most recent experience
God.
of drugs and alcohol is something that's very, very isolating. Like it's not a social lubricant, it's something that keeps people away from me. So
Yeah.
in some ways that's actually quite helpful because like that's the thing that I remember that I need to avoid. And yeah, I mean there's no way I can do any of that in moderation. But I've kind of uh, I'm I'm also like I'm now in my 40s and I don't enjoy staying up late anymore. Like I've become a very different person. Like I like to go to bed early.
Yeah. Yeah.
I need
Yeah.
my sleep. Um, and I really enjoy,
Yeah.
that. And I don't need like I don't need a substance to enjoy myself, and I don't need to go out to kind of expand my horizons. I'm like happy with what I've got, you know?
Do you remember a time when you never thought you could do without alcohol?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when when I got to the point where I was getting some help and I first said to a counselor about like the amount of drinking and drugs I was doing in secret, um, and realizing that that was a problem, um, I really didn't want to tell anyone about that because my biggest worry was I know they're going to tell me I need to stop doing it. And it's the only
Yeah.
solution I have for all of these problems that I've got. So don't take away my only solution because like I'm clinging on to
Yeah.
this. Um, and then when I started, when the drugs and alcohol were out of the way and out of my system, and I started like getting my feelings back,
Yeah.
um, I was able to kind of work through that in a supported way, with professionals and all the rest of it, um, and actually deal with what was going on underneath. And eventually, I stopped needing it, you know? But that it's easy for me now, looking back 6 years later, saying like, oh, I did this, I did this, I did this, and then I, stopped using drugs and alcohol, and everything was fine, everything got better. Like the first 30 days, 90 days, 6 months were really, really hard. Like I'm not like it was a like the only thing I had to do every day was get up, speak to people, go out, go to meetings for, people in drug and alcohol recovery, um,
Yeah.
and not drink and not use drugs. Like that was my only job for 6 months was not using drugs.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was in a quite a privileged position to be able to do that at the time. Um, but that was really, really hard. And I've seen lots of other people really struggle. So I'm not going to pretend any of that is easy and like give up drugs and
Oh, it's
alcohol and everything's
hard.
going to get instantly better. Like it takes a lot of work and effort, and it suddenly having all your feelings back is a bit overwhelming as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you got to make sure you get the right level of support to be able to kind of do all of that.
Because you speak a little bit about what was going on, what was lying beneath it. What was beneath it, Eugene?
I mean, a lot of different things. A lot of the way that I was feeling was driven by like a self-loathing, um, a feeling that I wasn't good enough, a feeling that I wasn't, you know, lovable, or that I didn't deserve support or love
Yeah,
or
yeah,
acceptance. Just a lot of those types of feelings. And I was looking at the relationship. I was going to say the relationship that I was in at the time. I'm still in that relationship. My partner and I have been together for like 17 years now.
yeah,
But for a very long time in my relationship, I felt like I was getting away with being in this relationship, like that I'd somehow hoodwinked this man into a relationship with me, and he was
yeah.
eventually going to find out what a terrible person I was and leave me. Like that was what I thought for a very long time. And he never could understand why I would feel that way, because he never,
Yeah,
he was always very loving, very supportive, never gave me any reason to think that way.
yeah,
But that was just the way that I was hardwired in my brain. And I'm not that way anymore. I've had a lot of help and support, and
yeah, yeah,
I was able to build up my self-confidence. Um, a lot of it was like when you start going down the kind of therapy route, like there's a lot of stuff that you point
yeah.
to in childhood and stuff like that that
Mm,
starts to explain how you ended up the way that you are.
yeah, yeah,
And I always thought that that was a bit I always kind of looked at it as like a woolly, kind of like silly, like, oh, I'm sure it's a bit weird. It doesn't really work. It sounded a bit like magic to me, like, oh, it's always
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
childhood. Like you're gonna look at you, it's always like the parents, or it's always the childhood, or something. And then when you actually like find out about it and you go into you're like, actually, it's as
yeah,
people, we're not as complicated as we think we are. We all kind of act in the same way if we have the same experiences.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
finding that out was actually a huge relief, that like I'm not some like weirdly complicated or terminally complicated person that can't survive a normal day without drugs or whatever. um I'm just made up of the kind of experiences and relationships that I've had in the past, and that's actually
yeah,
quite freeing, because um I was able to sort of get away from a lot of that thinking, by getting help and support. And actually, volunteering was something that a therapist really recommended that I do. It helped me to
yeah,
start to build up my self-confidence and self-esteem. And it put me on the path to like getting properly back into work, and starting to do things that I was proud of, and that really, really helped. But I mean, the question that you asked was about what was underlying it, and it was a lot of those thoughts and feelings that I'd developed over a very long period of time. But there was also other things, that like secrets I was holding on to, trauma. Um, I've talked about that fear I had of people finding out about my HIV, but asking questions about where it came from,
yeah,
and the way I got HIV was quite traumatic. Without going into too much detail, and it wasn't until I got to rehab that I talked about it for the first
yeah,
time. 7 years after it happened, that I first spoke about kind of what happened. And I, which I think is quite typical with people who've had this kind of trauma, I completely blame myself for everything that happened before and since, and had to be convinced by kind of speaking the words out loud and stuff, that I didn't have control over some of the things that happened, like that it wasn't my fault. And that was a really difficult but necessary and really cathartic process to go through, to kind of um, get everything out in the open. And I thought, like, when I told people about who I was and all of the things that happened to me, that they'd think that I was a terrible person, and that, I
You know, sorry, you know when you said that you blamed yourself, did you consciously or subconsciously blame yourself? Like, did you know what you was doing, or did you not know? You know what? Do you know what I
for
mean?
me it was conscious. Like I consciously blamed myself. I convinced myself that um anything that happened to me, including things that were completely outside of my control, were things that happened as a result of me being a really bad person, and like making some bad choices. And it's not that I like had no choice in any part of the process, but it I really thought it was more like, I would say it's more akin to like divine retribution almost, for like the
Mm,
kind of person that I was. Like that was the way of thinking. I was like, the bad things happen to bad people was the
yeah,
way that I thought. And I was like, bad things happen to me, so I must be a bad person, you know?
right, right, right. So, oh, Eugene. So, what do I say here? I think there must be, things that you've spoken about, the things that you've described around blaming yourself, around feeling different, around, your childhood, being brought up in a particular area, moving to a different school, you know, trying to be different at work, trying to fit into social situations, blaming yourself. Um, if there's somebody out there listening to this right now, Eugene, who can resonate with what you're saying and resonate with your story, what would you say to them?
It's going to sound really, really cliche, but I'm going to start by
Say it.
saying be yourself.
Yeah,
And I used to hear that and just think like that's just something that people say, and
yeah,
what does that even mean? But for me, I've gone through a journey in the last few years of finding out who I am. And I'm still on that journey. I still don't quite know. Um,
really.
but I was terrified before to find out who I was, because I thought I was going to find something horrible, you know? Um, and just being open to that journey, and just being open to the idea that I can stand on my own 2 feet,
Yeah,
be proud, and kind of say, this is who I am. And
yeah,
it's a privilege to get to that point, but it's very, very freeing. And what I've noticed is like, I was trying to change everything that I was so that people would like me. And people like me a lot more now that I've stopped doing that. Now that
yeah,
I'm being honest and being true and being true to
yeah,
myself,
yeah,
people have really responded to that. And like, I'm not doing it so that people will like me. I'm doing it so that I like myself.
yeah,
And slowly building up that self-esteem and self-confidence and stuff, and
yeah,
not apologizing constantly for who I am.
yeah,
Um, it's just really lovely. Like, um, there are probably people listening to this thinking like, I've got no idea what these people are talking about. But if you're listening to this thinking, oh, that sounds a bit like me, um, and like it's very easy to say like, oh, just be yourself. But like I didn't know how to, I had to learn.
this thing about you're not enough the way you are, because my therapist, said we talk about the word perfect. Who defines what perfect is?
Yeah,
And why can't we be enough the way that we are?
completely. And like, perfect is such a um like, I'm not like, the thing is, like, when somebody says, oh, you're never going to achieve perfect, sometimes I would hear that and think, oh, well, what you're saying is I should just give up then. And that's not what
Yeah,
people are, you know what I mean? Like, um I but
yeah,
striving for perfect all the time is exhausting and depressing, because there's no such thing
yeah,
as perfect. Like, you're never going to get there. And one of the things that really helped me in early recovery was they told me that I needed to focus on the next right thing. Do the next right thing. The next right thing might have been picking my cup up and putting it in the dishwasher. Like, it could be really,
yeah,
really simple.
yeah,
But just focus on the next right thing, and eventually you'll string together all the right things that you'll be on the right path. So like, don't think I need to change completely who I am, or I need to overnight become someone else, because that's not going to work. But look at doing the next right thing.
Yeah. Oh, look at doing the next right thing. I've got to write that down. Thank you so much for your time and sharing so authentically. How can people find you if they want to find out more about what you do, etc., on socials?
You can find me. I'm all across socials. So I'm Eugene Lynch on Instagram, all one word. I'm also Eugene Lynch 83 on TikTok. That's where you'll find a lot of my story. And I have a link tree on both of those that kind of links to various different pages. What I do for a job is I'm a director at the Terence Higgins Trust, HIV charity. It's the place that I went to get counseling. And they've never got rid of me since. So I went from being a service user to being a volunteer on the helpline to being a volunteer Positive Voices speaker to managing the Positive Voices program, and now directing all of the HIV prevention and support services that the Terence Higgins Trust delivers. So I've kind of been on quite a journey. But yeah, you can find me in lots of places. You can't get rid of me now. I'm all over the place.
Oh, thank you so much. Stay on the line. Thank you, and thank you.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks for everything that you do, because you do a fantastic amount of stuff all over the place. You're an inspiration.
Oh, as are you. It's mutual.
Thanks for watching Auntie Lou's Hour. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe.